Think back to the first time you ever got money in your hands. Perhaps it was a token from grandma. Perhaps it was an allowance for cleaning your room. Perhaps it was something you were simply not permitted to touch. Whatever it was, it planted a thought in your head, a thought that has since been guiding you along the financial path you're on today. The scary thing is, chances are you don't believe that your net worth is the result of your hard work as an adult. Your bank account is in fact being guided by a different you, one that's 7 years old. These subconscious money beliefs are what some psychologists like to call money scripts. The term was popularized by Brad Klontz, a financial psychologist who has spent his time investigating why so many financially responsible adults tend to sabotage their success with terrible financial decisions. His work has uncovered some frightening truths, namely, the fact that when it comes to money, most of us don't actually use the rational, adult part of our brains at all. In fact, the decision-making processes governing your money tend to be ruled by an unconscious set of rules learned before the age of 7, and mostly unquestioned thereafter. Before you learned to count, you already had your money beliefs drilled into you. The things you saw your parents do with money shaped your relationship with it in ways you might not even understand. You didn't learn about money through instruction. You only learned via observation. A parent's stress when seeing the mail, an argument about money after you fall asleep, grandma's penny-pinching ways from her youth, all ingrained into you on a subconscious level. That's why it's so hard to rationalize with a screaming toddler. The emotions have no grounding in reason. Same with these early memories shaping your financial disposition. Emotions, not reason, are the deciding factor. Klontz has categorized 4 major money scripts that seem to be common across human experience, however. Money avoidance is a belief that money is somehow dirty or evil. It manifests itself as self-defeating behaviors when the subject appears to be getting ahead in life. Money worship is the belief that wealth makes life good, resulting in dangerous spending and saving habits to attain more wealth. Money status represents the idea that self-worth is directly tied to net worth with similarly dysfunctional results. Finally, money vigilance is a belief that money should always be saved and spent cautiously, often resulting in chronic financial anxiety. These scripts, however, are far from comprehensive or universal. Most people carry a mix of traits from each with varying levels of dysfunction. They also tend to have very little basis in reality, hence the prevalence of bad financial decision-making amongst humans. After all, if nobody taught you about money explicitly, how are you supposed to understand it? Well, here's the not particularly reassuring answer. You aren't. The thing is, it's entirely normal to have unconscious financial biases. What's not normal is the fact that they tend to affect what you actually do with your money. There's a fascinating study done by behavioral economists showcasing the ways humans with a certain money script make poorer financial decisions than those without. People who grew up with the idea of money being scarce have an ingrained bias against planning for the future because they believe money to be transient. This affects their financial decisions throughout their lives as they unconsciously avoid locking any money away for later use. People who grew up with money being plentiful, however, have the opposite bias. To them, saving money feels like an unnecessary deprivation that they unconsciously avoid. They spend more freely because to them, the money has always been there, and therefore it's safe to use. In later years, when they could benefit from being more careful, they find it much harder to adjust their habits to reflect the new reality, because these habits have been unconsciously reinforced for their entire lives. That's precisely the problem with most financial advice, really. The people most likely to benefit from it are the ones who most need to have their irrational biases addressed. Unfortunately, the process of actually fixing these scripts requires confronting people with the things that made them form in the first place. That's rarely convenient, and even less common that people actually do it. That's why most of the advice given to them is little more than ineffective busy work with lots of charts, tables, and formulas. In economics, the idea that humans are completely rational beings is generally considered to be a fallacy. The work of behavioral economists throughout the last few decades has uncovered numerous unconscious biases affecting the decision-making processes of humans when it comes to money. The most prominent of these is the fact that losses feel much worse than equivalent gains. This has led to countless financial decisions being made out of a desire to simply minimize loss rather than maximize gains. Daniel Kahneman, the psychologist who has spent several decades studying the ways humans and their irrational relationship with money works, has uncovered numerous similar examples. According to him, humans have a tendency to judge any financial decision in regards to some reference point rather than basing said decision on strict logic. That reference point is in turn often determined by the unconscious biases formed during childhood. It turns out that the way money was handled in your family home has much to do with why you have the financial disposition you do. If one grew up around scarcity, they're much more likely to believe that having money at all is a temporary situation, and thus they should spend it before it's gone. Likewise, if one grew up around abundance, there's a tendency to view money as something that should always be saved for later, because it's never been there before. Finally, if one grew up around families that were very careful around money, avoiding talking about it, saving every penny, and making every financial decision with great care, they're likely to unconsciously feel guilt about spending money on themselves later in life, even when they have plenty to spare. In short, most of our money behaviors are unconscious. The entire reason why they're so difficult to overcome is because they're not rooted in reason at all, but rather early childhood experiences. That, unfortunately, makes most financial advice that tries to tackle them directly largely ineffective at best. Most people aren't really aware of just what went into the formation of their money beliefs in the first place. Understanding it is often much easier said than done, especially when it comes to childhood memories involving family. This is in part why so many economically stable people who lived through the Great Depression were so cautious with what little money they had. This caution was passed on to their children, who in turn passed it on to their own kids many decades later. These people lived through a period of unprecedented economic instability, and so they were justifiably reluctant to make any financial commitments beyond the bare minimum. As a result, their descendants grew up being just as cautious, even with the increased stability of the modern-day economy. By contrast, many people from families who didn't live through the same financial horrors of the Depression had a much more stable relationship with money. For them, it was simply a tool, and so their financial behaviors were much less affected by the same kinds of unconscious biases as their parents and grandparents. This is not to suggest they didn't have their own problems. After all, some people from the Depression had to be very creative with their financial habits in order to survive. They spent their lives learning exactly how to stretch every penny as far as possible. As a result, the behaviors they passed on to their children were somewhat different but no less damaging. For instance, many of them became unable to spend money on themselves even when they had it. It's also worth pointing out that while most financial behaviors are unconsciously formed, this isn't necessarily always the case. In reality, most of them are a combination of learned behaviors and rational decision-making, with neither being entirely dominant. People who grew up in poor families may have had to make much more rational financial decisions than those who were able to rely on their parents' resources. As such, their financial habits are often the product of careful consideration rather than unconscious disposition. However, for most people, these unconscious financial biases tend to form early and strongly, with very long-lasting consequences. The good news is, unlike your childhood tendencies, you can actually grow out of these money scripts. The research of psychologists such as Brad Klontz has shown that once you become aware of the existence of these scripts in the first place, acknowledging their presence tends to weaken their grip on your financial decisions. That being said, in most cases, the actual process of dealing with them can be fairly complex and emotionally taxing, especially when dealing with the formation of the script itself. For most people, that's when professional help is useful if available. The point is, you might want to actually reflect on what your relationships with money were growing up. Was money plentiful or scarce? Was it strictly controlled by parents or freely given? Did your parents talk about it much, or did they avoid discussing it at all costs? Whatever the answers are, they're most likely informing a large amount of your financial decisions today. The good news is, as an adult, you can choose to change those things if need be. Some people grow up discovering that they have unconscious biases affecting their financial behaviors. Some find out that they tend to spend too much money because, as a kid, they received affection in the form of spending. Others find out that they tend to be too cheap for their own good, because when they spent as a child, they were told they were selfish. These tendencies don't reflect poorly on their character, really. They're simply the result of their childhood experiences. Unfortunately, the financial industry isn't particularly good at acknowledging this. After all, it's much easier to sell you an investment strategy or a budgeting technique than it is to help you come to grips with decades of unconscious biases. That being said, the facts remain that when it comes to financial decision-making, human behaviors are rarely rational. These decisions are often guided by unconscious money scripts that people form before they even understand what money is. It's important to recognize this fact for what it is, because it is the only way to begin correcting the things that affect our financial behaviors in unhealthy ways. That doesn't mean you should ignore your money issues, or that there's nothing you can do about your bad financial behaviors. On the contrary, if you're struggling with something like this, it may be worth speaking to a professional about it. The most important step is to actually becoming aware of the problem in the first place, and the awareness is often the hardest part of overcoming it. Next time you feel anxious about your finances, take a moment to consider why that might be. Think about what your relationship to money was as a child. Think about what you might be anxious about in regards to money. You just might be surprised to discover that it's not really the money itself you're upset about. It's something else entirely, something that happened long ago,